Welcome back, everyone. We've got everyone connected now, and we're going to start with our first panel of the day after that excellent keynote. We are going to have one translated paper on this session, which is the second paper, and we are ably assisted on that by Julianne Rudiser, for which we're very thankful. So I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and then they're going to give their papers, and again, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So we thank everyone for putting your questions in the chat. Not in the chat, in the Q&A at the bottom, please. If you have any issues, do put those in the chat and we will address those. But otherwise, all questions should go into the Q&A so that I can then feed them to our speakers at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers now. So Edson Krenak Dornelis de Andrade is an Indigenous activist, writer, and doctoral student at the University of Vienna, Austria, where he developed studies in legal anthropology. He holds a degree in linguistics and literary theory from the Federal University of São Carlos in Brazil. Edson Krenak works as a speaker and a trainer at the UCA Institute in Brazil. As a writer, he won the 10th National Taimos Award for Indigenous Writers in Brazil with the book Osano de Borum, and his story, Kren and Pokran, Why Is There No Twing Among the Krenak People, is part of the 2018 book supported by UNICEF, Nos, Anthology of Indigenous Tales. At Cultural Survival, Edson Krenak coordinates programs in Brazil, supporting various layers of work, including advocacy, capacity building, and the Keepers of the Earth Fund. Our second speaker is Carlos Eduardo Lemos Chaves, who graduated in law from the Federal University of Bahia. He is a specialist in social rights in the field of agrarian residency and through the National Program for Education in Agrarian Reform and the Federal University of Goiás. He is a master's candidate in the postgraduate program in agrarian law at the Federal University of Goiás. So now we're going to start with Edson. Thank you, Edson.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I turn here my on. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I don't know where you are right now, but it's a pleasure to be here. I would like to say thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts and the reflection on indigenous maps in Brazil and South America. I'll be talking about two maps, especially Munduruku map, but I will also use Guarani people from Ecuador as another example of indigenous map. The title, How to Map My Body, I will be discussing some ontological and historical aspects of indigenous maps. And I would like to start off with this saying that I shall be visiting this code again at the end of my presentation, giving possible indigenous perspective or paraphrases on this code. A map says to you, read me carefully, follow me closely, doubt me not. It says, I am the earth in the palm of your hand. Without me, you are alone and lost. By Beryl Markham, cited by J.B. Harley. Well, first of all, I would like to walk you all through some historical examples on where we see indigenous bodies represented. For that, I need you to keep in mind three important words that will be cited in my presentation. That is ontology, how we indigenous peoples see a map as a kind of a tool to access or to translate reality. In this case, the bodies in the world, relations that we see maps as a communication to discuss about relations, our relationship with nature, with other species, with others. And as I said, translation because for indigenous peoples, the main problem in activism, in the relationship with other societies, is the difficulties that non-indigenous people have to communicate, to accept, to understand, better saying, some aspects of indigenous world. And then maps also refer to a kind of translation of their worlds. Then, as I said, I walk through some maps that display indigenous bodies, as those maps here you can see from the 16th century, that indigenous people are represented or misrepresented as cannibals, as a part of a unknown world, terra incognita, or terra nullis. The indigenous people are, their bodies are represented along monsters, among creatures without soul, etc. This map, we see how the power and the military endeavor by the colonizers, Spanish and the Portuguese people, deployed on Brazil especially, and how the indigenous bodies were represented as a wild, savage, and without rules, without a king, without faith, without laws. Then after the first 2-3 centuries of the representation of these land, the indigenous territories and their bodies, we start seeing maps without bodies, maps without the presence of the indigenous people. I call this historical phenomenon that is also coincides with the beginning of so-called scientific maps, canceling the other. We have this sketch or croquis representing how Portuguese people already in the 18th century, actually they used maps for military campaigns against indigenous people, against their bodies. This one, we also we can see how all indigenous references were completely wiped out from the maps. As highly this says, the maps anticipate the empire, how the topology, the toponymy of the new maps completely rewrite the history of the territory without considering indigenous peoples. My maps that I will be discussing, they come from these two areas, especially here on the right part, Brazil, the Munduruku lands. And another map I will be mentioning is Guarani people from Ecuador. I have been working with Munduruku people for more than 10 years now, and Guarani for almost 2 years. We have been talking, discussing ideas about the maps, about their territories. And the one reason why those people, the indigenous people, they decided to use maps that was something new for them is because what the state, society, or projects were doing to their territories, what they consider their own bodies. We see here just an example. I will walk you very quickly. I apologize for that. The sites of gold mining, deforestation, several projects that are destroying the indigenous lands and contaminate the biodiversity, degrading this area, bringing diseases to indigenous peoples. And in this area, for example, where shows this map shows the territory of Munduruku people, the impact of mercury or better saying, gold mining. This data shows that 6 out of 10 participants in the research, in the test, presented mercury levels above safe thresholds by the WHO. Another problem that we see in the Guarani territory is the oil drilling, completely destroying, dividing, invading their territories, their lands, their animals, their food, their ways of life. This one example of one photography of the Munduruku territory. I will be discussing a little bit more about this territory that has been suffering this kind of endeavors and projects. Munduruku people feel that this is happening to their own bodies, as I just mentioned about the mercury, about the other diseases, other problems that happening to the land, but on the indigenous peoples. This is another photo that shows what is going on there on site. And now I will move to my main argument, that it's the body of the land. Now I wanted to give some cosmological background and the ontological discussions on what the body or the land represents for indigenous peoples. This is very striking to me because actually I have found this thought, this way of thinking among several indigenous peoples in the world. Like we can see here, Natalie Diaz Mojave, saying that when we create, we invoke the body, our own and every body that came before us, against erasure, against massacre, against imprisonment, against illness, against forgetfulness, against this canceling the other. When we imagine these bodies in our work, we are imagining our homelands. This connection between body and land is even deeper among Amazonian groups. As we can see here, Vilaça and Unzendowski affirms the Amazonian body is never totalized or made whole. It is not just adorned, painted, or fabricated in relation to ritual practices. It is also vulnerable and an agent of attraction, both of bad and good energies, qualities, and powers that reveal the cosmic embeddedness of the body within a predatory world. Therefore, the human-animal body as the manifestation of the soul land, the territory is never just prey, food, inhabitants, moving objects, subjects in the territory, but the bodies in a constant exchange of life energy, souls, complementary or amalgamation of multiple perspectives of the same body. Therefore, the indigenous body, the soul, from that perspective, the soul and body are individual. They can inhabit different spaces. In the indigenous cosmology, they share the body and the soul with the territory. They are species, soul bodies of the land. Therefore, their bodies are manifestations of the land. Is the way the territory, the Mother Earth express or manifests itself on the surface of the territory. You can see some paintings here. I like to use as an illustration here, but also to show how in several ways this imagination of the land and the body are present in the indigenous territories. The territories, they consider the history of the land, and their body is a manifestation of this history. That's why they consider the memory, they are the living memory of each piece of land. The territory soul actualize the body. The territory is the reality of the body. The soul is not just spiritual or immaterial substance, but the accumulation of experiences within and through the bodies. There's another way to see this relationship between body and the territory, and also representation, maps, drawings, paintings. Is the body paints among the Munduruku people. The body paints reflects, as they say, a mirror of what they see in the territory, a relationship between people, how they treat each other, this pedagogy of taking care of the body, appreciation towards animals and plants. They wanted to be like the animals. They also, the body paints also represented the landscapes, how they move around, how they feel as a part of the space where they live in. The bodies of all creatures are physical and creative, as I mentioned, manifestations of the soul, that they consider this soul is a shared substance with the territory. The relation between soul, territory, and the body is translated in mapped, territorialized, and cartographic narratives. In many cosmological narratives of these two people, especially Munduruku, you find several cartographic references, how their body teaches through paintings, other rituals, how to go to some places, how to find their ancestors, how to find the spirits, the gods, how to nourish spiritually this ecological experience. Just moving here some buttons, sorry. This experience of the territory as part of their own bodies is also shared among other species. One concept that helps us to understand this idea is the idea of semiosphere, this cultural space-time that creates or illustrates ontological dependence. Semiosphere organize, hierarchize, memorize, translate, interpret, and examine larger historical cumulative relations. Therefore, when we talk about Haorani semiosphere or Munduruku semiosphere, we are talking about a deep ontological dependence where all relations reflect this ecological management between body and soul, between territory and people living in this territory. They understand the territory as the sine qua non condition to exist. As they say in their own words, indigenous peoples depend for their existence upon the territory. Necessarily is a necessity. As peoples, we only exist because the territory as such, the way we found it with all landmarks, exists. The Warani experience with map is one strategy to show these relations, to show this that they don't live in a wild, empty jungle as many may think, or as Omari Ima Omeni here in the point 6 she expresses. When we decide to stay in the jungle, we look for places with plants that are useful and historical. Those places were created by our ancestors, and today we continue enriching each other through the territory. The forest is not wild, is their own garden. It's just one representation of the Warani territory. Sorry. They also affirm, the Warani people, that the map they create is to protect to protect the territory against the oil blocks. It looks, when the government map represents this territory as a empty space. This is the government's view of the Amazon, the forest. But our forest, homeland, is not an oil block. We have created our map to show that our territory is full of life. I have to, in order to be able to conclude my presentation, I have to move a little bit faster. This diagram represents that at the center of their mapping activities, all activities they do is the traditional ecological knowledge they hold for generations. They involve communities, they learn tools, they collaborate with non-indigenous peoples, they learn how to use technologies, they use other indigenous peoples as partners to teach them how to defend their own body soul through using maps as a tool. The Munduruku map of life, as you probably saw on the exhibition, is a map. Is also a collective endeavor that represents all species that they are their relatives, represents the sacred place. There is no a center necessarily, but a myriad of relations in this map. You can find these maps representing their stories, how their narratives, their cosmological perspectives. For them, mapping is a weapon that they use to defend themselves. Map is translation, is a translated message to our enemies. The map is to strengthen our struggle and to show where are the places that cannot be destroyed, where our sacred things are, everything that cannot be touched, the sense of sacredness, the holiness of the territory. Here we see photos by Greenpeace. Was a project that was financed by Greenpeace and supported by them. Also the Warani people, their project were like supported by Digital Democracy. I would like also to take opportunity to say thank you to them for sharing a lot of archives, photos, etc. And we see here from the making the map to using the map at the capital city of the country to defend, to fight for the territory. This process is not only collective, but it's full of life, of representation. They try to translate their cosmological, ontological dependence on this map. What we see in the Munduruku cartography is a constant body-soul interaction, a notion of territorial bodies being made within the territory. We can see those ideas represent several of their narratives and rituals. This would be a representation of the Munduruku semiosphere, where they see that the Karu Sakaibi is their creator, their god, and he creates like layers of relations. Everything in the territory connected through the water. Every species has its own purpose, its own role, and they should protect each other. If one layer is taken away from that, the territory is compromised. Their own body is compromised. As they say in another paper I discussed, most of sacred places are alongside rivers as they guard magical instruments. They house spirits, they provide food, they ensure the spiritual and social health of the community. They are discussing these ideas, they're revealing this sacred place that was secret for centuries right now because the state projects on their own lands. Unfortunately, one of these places that we can see here, the Cachoeira Sete Quedas, Paris Bicheche, was destroyed by a hydroelectric. Then they consider that the reason why many women cannot get pregnant anymore, many kids, babies, they are born sick, the children are not growing up strong because their own land is compromised, is sick, has been destroyed. That's why we think that mapping translate these transformations at their own bodies, their own experience with their own territory into this kind of representation. In one hand, we saw that the imposition of the Western cartography with their lines, border frontiers, pieces of lands that ignore relations, ignore ontologies, actually make them to see as they was limiting their own relations and their own plan, their own territory. That's why they need their own map to transform this narrative from a cosmological, ontological description to a political discourse, to advocacy, to show resilience. These are threshold of the Munduruku use of the map. Is they use the map as a tool to protect their own territory, as a cosmological translation to show this ontological dependency, those relations, the ecological knowledge, and also to deal with the legacy of the colonialism. When we study what the literature talks about mapping the cartography in its all history, not from just colonial, but also state cartography, we can also compare with how indigenous peoples, especially Guarani and Unduruku people, are producing their maps and discovering their own rules of their own cartography. That's why I prepared this chart to compare two ways or two methods to do mapping, to do cartography. I want to read all of them, but I can share with you in another moment. If you want, you write me your email, I can share my slides with you. But what I wanted to show here is how the indigenous maps, they wanted to put together not only the ontological, cosmological perspectives, but also show the political engagement, activism they are doing to defend their own territories. Proposing a non-anthropocentric cartography that highlights the bodies of the land as a body with soul, as again Natalie Natalie Diaz put in so clearly. One is injured as easily as the other. The people and the territory both have memories. To take care of the earth is to take care of the self. Our languages, our images, our stories arise from our bodies, from the dirts and waters we were formed from. This idea represents this relationship between bodies and the territory, how they now they are learning and doing cartography. In the beginning, I wanted to revisit this sentence by Beryl Markham, and to give you indigenous or cosmological paraphrase based on my experience. My map tells you, read me carefully, follow me closely, don't doubt me, it says. I am the earth in your body. It is not possible to live without me, for I am the soul of your body. And indeed, you are. The true maps of this world are destroyed and vanish under the direction of malevolent hands. Every man is going blind. Every seed is becoming alien to life. The forests are mute, death, and the rivers thirsty. Birds do not fly over the horizon, as they are no more birds. Today, you look at the map you have on your body, feeling it, running a finger along its lines. They are hot lines of anonymous, of blood, of juniper, material that indigenous people use for painting. Our map is full of life, of grace, born from the footsteps of our ancestors, established by their relationships. That shore there, that jagged sketch of scarlet paint, shows the fishing bank, the sacred river, and the rock, my sister. They speak of our creator, of the marks left on the jaguar's fur and on the lynx's eyes. The brown stain that covers your body speaks to a mountain that captures your eyes. Here is a valley, there a swamp and there a tree. And here is a river that some curious and brave soul, like a pencil in the creator's hand, traced for the first time with bleeding hands. Thank you very much.
Edson, thank you. That was powerful and beautiful and so informative. Thank you so much. It was really, really amazing. Carlos and Julianne, do you now want to share your screen once Edson unshares his? And we can start with Carlos's presentation.
All right. Carlos, se você quer testar compartilhamento de tela.
Sim, eu vou projetar aqui num minuto.
Okay.
Aparece para vocês?
Sim, sim.
Perfeito.
Uhum.
Prontinho, vocês me veem, me ouvem?
Sim, perfeitamente.
Ok. Estamos prontos? Podemos começar?
Sim, podemos começar.
Ok, obrigado. Gostaria de iniciar saudando a todos e agradecendo o convite do meu amigo Edson, a tradução da minha amiga Juliane e a toda a equipe que está envolvida aqui no projeto, a Kate, Celine, Tyler, Laura.
All right. First of all, I'd like to greet everyone and thanks for the invitation to participate in this event. Thanks on Edson for facilitating this. Thanks for the translation and also the whole team at Stanford University.
Bom, pouco diferente do trabalho que o Edson acabou de apresentar, brilhantemente, eu não vou falar sobre povos indígenas, mas sobre comunidades quilombolas aqui no Brasil, mais especificamente da comunidade Rio dos Macacos, no meu estado, que é o estado da Bahia.
All right, so different to Edson, who brilliantly presented his insights on indigenous people, I will be sharing information regarding Quilombola communities. If you're not familiar with the term, Quilombos are Brazilian hinterland settlements founded by people of African origin, and I'll be sharing with you some insights on a particular community, the community of Rio dos Macacos in my state of Bahia, Northeast Brazil.
Bom, a princípio, eu acho que é importante dizer que o Brasil foi o último país das Américas a abolir a escravização de pessoas que foram sequestradas no continente africano e que eram usadas como mão de obra aqui no Brasil no período da colonização portuguesa. Esse período colonial ele deixa um uma herança muito negativa na estrutura fundiária brasileira, que ainda hoje leva essa marca da escravização, tanto de povos indígenas quanto dos povos negros traficados para cá, do latifúndio. O Brasil ainda hoje tem uma das maiores concentrações fundiárias do mundo, e da monocultura, uma monocultura voltada para a exportação, que também tem graves consequências socioambientais para o país.
Okay, it's very important to start by saying that Brazil was one of the last countries, if not the last country, to abolish slavery, and to abolish the slavery of people who were imprisoned and taken from Africa to serve as laboring hands in plantation during the period of Portuguese colonization. And this period has left many marks in the social structure in Brazil as a whole, but also on the land ownership scheme in Brazil.
Bom, e é importante trazer também que, antes mesmo que a escravatura fosse abolida no Brasil, a primeira lei de terras do país já cuidava de excluir esse povo negro escravizado da estrutura fundiária do país.
Okay, so it's very important to add that long before Brazil abolished slavery, laws already excluded people of African origin and impacted them in a negative way long before slavery was abolished.
E ainda após a abolição da escravatura no país, não houve qualquer política pública para a inserção do povo negro, agora liberto, tanto na economia do país, tanto na vida pública nacional. E a lei de terras, ao determinar a compra com
Carlos, Carlos, um momento, senão eu não te acompanho. So even after slavery was abolished, there was no public plan to include people of African descent in the public sphere regarding the process of land sharing and in the economy and so on.
Ok. E, ao determinar essa lei de terras do país que a compra e venda seria a única forma de aquisição da propriedade no país, ao mesmo tempo que excluía esse povo da economia, não permitia essa participação do povo negro na estrutura fundiária.
So when the law was passed and determined that land ownership could only come in terms of buying and selling, people of African origin were excluded in this process of land ownership.
Enfim, após 300 anos de escravização dessas pessoas no país, só depois de 100 anos dessa libertação é que o Estado brasileiro finalmente reconheceu na atual Constituição o direito de propriedade a essas comunidades, às suas terras, seus territórios tradicionais.
All right, so after 300 years of slavery and only after 100 years of abolishing slavery did the Brazilian Constitution consider a right to land concerning people of African origin in Brazil.
E ainda assim foi uma grande luta no judiciário, inclusive, para que essas comunidades quilombolas, essas comunidades que seriam descendentes dessas pessoas que foram escravizadas, elas não fossem tratadas pela lei apenas como resquícios históricos daquelas comunidades antigas, mas que fossem reconhecidas como comunidades atuais, comunidades constituídas em qualquer tempo histórico a partir dessa resistência do povo negro ao racismo e à opressão que ainda existe hoje no Brasil, institucionalizada contra essas comunidades.
And even though rights of African Brazilians are being recognized, it has taken a long struggle against racism and against recognizing people of African descent in a specific time, but recognizing everyone in every historical time, regardless if now or centuries ago.
Bom, dito isto, eu queria trazer a atenção aqui da nossa exposição os mapas que eu vou projetar a partir de agora.
So I'd like you to call your attention to the maps that I have brought to show you.
Este primeiro mapa, ele foi confeccionado pela Marinha do Brasil, porque
The first map was compiled by the Brazilian Marine.
Porque este caso que nós vamos trazer aqui trata-se da invasão de um território quilombola pelo Estado brasileiro, através da Marinha do Brasil das Amazônias.
The case that we are talking about here in particular shows the invasion of the Brazilian Marine in a piece of land that is traditionally belongs to a Quilombola community.
Então, este mapa aqui ele traz a divisão entre 3 fazendas, a Fazenda Aratu, a Fazenda Meireles e a Fazenda Macacos, e vocês podem notar aqui que tem o curso de um rio, onde a Marinha do Brasil, na década de 1950, viria a construir uma barragem.
So this map shows you the division among 3 different farms. There's Aratu farm, Meireles farm, and Macacos farm. And in the middle, you can see a river that was used or invaded by the Brazilian Marine in around 1950s.
Alguns anos depois, seria construído também, dentro do território quilombola, uma vila naval para servir de moradias para os oficiais da Marinha.
So this river was used by the Brazilian Marine in order to build a dam. And a couple of years later, a village was built by the Marine in this Quilombola territory.
Todo esse processo dessas construções inauguram para a comunidade um período de terror, com exploração do trabalho, expulsão das famílias e toda sorte de violência física, psicológica, violência sexual.
All right, so the beginning or the inauguration of this village marks a period of sheer terror for the Quilombola community, and this period is connected to a period of utter violence in all senses: physical violence, exploration of a labor hand, psychological violence, sexual violence, and so on.
Todo esse processo de violência ele só fica visível já no ano de 2009, quando a Marinha com ações judiciais para expulsar o restante dessa comunidade desse território tradicional.
So all this violent process that started already in the 50s becomes apparent, or the public awareness is only raised in the 2000s when a process was moved, an action was moved to finally remove the community from their remaining land.
E a partir da resistência da comunidade a esses processos judiciais que determinam, tem uma decisão do juiz para a expulsão da comunidade, a comunidade consegue acionar o Estado brasileiro de forma a fazer com que o órgão fundiário inicie estudos para determinar o tamanho desse território.
So actually a court order was issued to remove the community, and that's when the community started organizing itself in a way of defending itself, and then a committee was commissioned in order to establish what has taken place before and bring clarity into this issue.
Esses estudos determinam que a comunidade teria território ocupado historicamente de toda essa área aqui, que representa em torno de 900 hectares.
So the study showed that, historically speaking, the area occupied and the area to which the community was entitled was this very big area that you can see here in the map.
Pelo mapa, nós podemos observar que aqui fica a área em que foi construída a barragem. Aqui é a área ocupada pela Marinha do Brasil, mas desse território a comunidade reivindicava apenas essa área aqui na cor verde.
So the map shows you where the Marine had built the dam. This part here in my screen, it's shown in kind of grayish white. It's where the Marine occupied, and although traditionally the Quilombola people occupied the whole area, they were only reivindicating the green area here seen on the map.
Isso porque toda essa área em amarelo está já atualmente ocupada por indústrias. Esta área em vermelho seria uma área já hoje de ocupação urbana, e essa área aqui, num tom de verde também, que seria o acesso dos quilombolas ao mar, também já estaria ocupado nesse processo industrial.
So the green area is being occupied by industries, and the red area shows urban expansion, and this kind of greenish yellowish area here shows the access the Quilombola traditionally had to the sea, but that has been now occupied by industrialized area.
Então, a área que a comunidade reivindicava para ser regularizada, para ser titulada pelo Estado brasileiro, seria essa área em verde aqui, que dos 900 hectares que a comunidade ocupava historicamente, apenas 301 hectares restava onde pudesse ser desenvolvida essa ocupação tradicional.
So the total area originally had around 900 hectares, and now the community was reivindicating around 300 hectares, which is the green area shown here in the map.
Neste processo de resistência da comunidade, inclusive com decisões judiciais determinando a sua expulsão do território,
so in the process of resistance of this community, which included court orders to remove the community from their territories,
a comunidade ela conseguiu estabelecer processo de negociação direta com o Estado brasileiro, com o governo brasileiro, independente da decisão judicial.
Carlos, você cortou, a comunidade conseguiu estabelecer?
Processo de negociação com o governo brasileiro. Perfeito?
Yes, so the community managed to establish a process of negotiation with Brazilian state.
Essa foto de satélite são para ilustrar as propostas que foram feitas pelo Estado brasileiro à comunidade.
So this picture here shows some of the proposals that the Brazilian government made to the community.
Essa primeira proposta que está ilustrada aqui era de apenas 7,5 hectares e fora a área da comunidade, que fica aqui dentro dessa área aqui.
So the first area that was proposed on the left entailed only 7.5 hectares and was outside the central area, was reivindicated by the community.
A segunda e a terceira proposta consistem em a segunda numa área de apenas 21 hectares dentro do território tradicional e a terceira proposta somando essa área de 21 hectares mais a de 7,5 que já havia sido oferecida fora do território.
So the second proposal done by the Brazilian government was an area of around 21 hectares inside the community area. And then there was a third proposal, which included the first proposal of 7.5 hectares and outside the territory of the community, plus this area of 21 hectares inside the community. So a total, a third proposal was a total of 28.5 hectares in total.
Aqui nós vemos qual foi a quarta proposta do governo brasileiro, que já passa a incluir uma área maior, diante dos inúmeros protestos e da resistência da comunidade, que inclusive consegue obter esse estudo que foi feito pelo governo brasileiro, tendo uma prova do tamanho original do seu território.
So after much resistance, there was even a fourth proposal of a much bigger area of 86 hectares within the community area, and based on results of the study done by the government, which demonstrated that originally the area occupied by this community was much larger.
É importante observar nesse mapa que, pela proposta que foi feita pelo governo brasileiro, todas as fontes de água que cortam o território ficam fora da área que seria destinada à comunidade quilombola, que é essa área aqui em verde.
It's very important to notice that all the proposals, and in particular this one shown here in this picture, shows that all water springs were outside or are outside the area proposed by the Brazilian government.
E é importante também perceber que toda essa área que está em verde, em verdade, ela era formada por uma mata, uma floresta de remanescente de Mata Atlântica que não poderia ser desmatado para ser utilizada para a agricultura.
And it's also important to notice that in this area we have virgin forest, which cannot be cut down, cannot be deforested for agricultural purposes.
Também toda essa área seria a área justamente que a comunidade planejava utilizar para a agricultura coletiva.
And this area which I'm showing you right now shows that area that the community had originally planned to use for collective agriculture.
E também uma questão muito grave é que em toda essa região aqui existem famílias da comunidade também que habitam e haviam alguns moradores também nessa área que estavam fora dessa proposta do governo.
And it's very important to mention that outside this area proposed by the Brazilian government, we still have families, we still have people inhabiting this other areas, and so they would be excluded from this proposal.
E neste mapa que traz ampliada a área dessa proposta em maior detalhe, é importante porque vemos aqui que, embora o mapa confeccionado pelo governo apresentasse alguns cursos d'água, que eles diziam que eram rios, são rios intermitentes, são rios que não são perenes, ou seja, só existem quando há fortes chuvas na região.
So although this picture here, this map here shows that there are rivers running through the proposed area, these are only temporary water springs. These access to water is only available in times of heavy rain.
Este mapa aqui, ele ilustra o que foi uma contraproposta oferecida pela comunidade nesse processo de diálogo com o governo brasileiro.
So this map shows you a counter-proposal that was made by the community in this process of negotiations with the Brazilian government.
Nesse mapa aqui, nós podemos observar com o contorno em vermelho os 301 hectares reivindicados.
Carlos, você está cortando. Os 300 hectares.
Reivindicados pela comunidade.
All right. So the red contour on the map shows you the 300 hectares that were reivindicated by the community.
E esta área que está em verde aqui seriam mais 30 hectares que a comunidade negociaria, deixaria para a Marinha do Brasil, cuja Vila Naval está concentrada aqui, fazendo uma espécie de uma separação entre as atividades da Marinha e o território tradicional.
So the area shown here in green it displays the area that the community would be prepared to negotiate and make a concession for the Brazilian Marine, and separating the area occupied by the Marine from these traditional areas occupied by the community. And you can see just outside the Marine areas is the Marine village. So there would be some sort of separation between Marine occupied area and traditionally occupied area.
Observem que essa contraproposta da comunidade, ela tem um espaço de comunicação entre os moradores dessa área e os moradores do restante da comunidade.
So this proposal shows that there is an area of communication between the inhabitants of the community and those who are on the outskirts or outside.
Mantém toda essa área aqui para a agricultura coletiva, para a sobrevivência da comunidade.
It maintains the central area for agricultural purposes and for survival purposes.
E mantém tanto o acesso à barragem, em azul, que é onde a comunidade pesca e tem acesso à água para diversos usos.
And it maintains the access to water, access to the dam, and this access is very important because the community uses the river for fishing purposes.
E também esses pequenos triângulos são áreas importantes do ponto de vista do sagrado, do religioso da comunidade, com templos, inclusive, de religiões afro-brasileiras.
And this small triangles portrait religious sites, sacred sites, with even temples of African or Afro-Brazilian descent, which are very, very important for this community.
Após a apresentação dessa proposta, o diálogo terminou sendo interrompido por conta de decisões do juiz da causa que proibia a comunidade, inclusive, de construir e reformar suas casas, embora isso já fosse acordado com o Estado brasileiro.
So after this proposal was presented, there was a court order. Well, the negotiations were stopped or at least paused. And so you can have an idea of the situation. Community members were forbidden to renovate their houses by the Brazilian state. Even though this had been previously agreed on by both parties.
E o processo de titulação do território da comunidade só continuou por força de uma outra decisão judicial que foi conseguida pela Defensoria Pública e pelo Ministério Público Federal.
And the process of land ownership by the community only proceeded through a court order done by the judiciary system.
Mas, ainda com a decisão judicial obrigando a continuidade do processo administrativo, os órgãos do Estado brasileiro decidiram por levar à frente essa titulação dos 86 hectares, incluindo essa área onde existem outros moradores da comunidade.
So even though there was a court order in the sense that negotiations would proceed, the state went ahead on establishing borders with this original 86 hectares proposal.
E aqui se observa que a área da comunidade não tem acesso à barragem nem às fontes de água, apenas a esse rio aqui que o Estado brasileiro afirma que existe, mas que não é existente.
So you can see that all the water paths are out of reach. There's only this imagined river, which the Brazilian government affirms to be existent, but as previously mentioned, there's only water access in heavy rain periods, if any at all.
Toda essa área aqui agricultável e que a comunidade pretendia exercer uma agricultura coletiva também fica de fora da titulação final.
So the original planned agricultural area, which would be used as collective agricultural land, is outside this area proposed by the government.
E talvez o mais grave, essa demarcação descontínua, essa demarcação em dois blocos diferentes, tira a comunicação das famílias que habitam esse lado com as famílias que habitam esse lado do território. Essa é a única forma dessas pessoas se encontrarem, teria que ser através das vias públicas agora, da estrada que passa aqui fora do território quilombola.
So, but the most serious implication of this partition is that the communication between community members living in the larger area and in the smaller area is blocked, is interrupted, and there can only be access via roads here on the left side.
E, atualmente, a comunidade tem uma luta muito importante que é pela água, porque depois da titulação do território, a Marinha pretendia fazer um muro aqui nessa margem da barragem, isolando completamente a comunidade do acesso à água.
So the main struggle nowadays is access to water. After this land partition was granted and signed, the Brazilian Marine started plans to build a wall around the river, around the dam, which would make the access to water even harder, if possible at all.
Finalizando, é importante dizer que todo esse processo, para além dessa violência simbólica através das ações judiciais e das decisões do governo brasileiro,
it's very important to say that the violence, the symbolic, beyond the violence committed by the Brazilian state and by the Brazilian legal system,
há também um processo de violência real, porque toda essa história da comunidade é marcada por crimes, por assassinatos que não foram ainda esclarecidos. A exemplo um assassinato que ocorreu bem nessa área onde haviam moradores que ficariam de fora da área da comunidade. Então, para viabilizar o discurso de que nenhuma família seria deslocada, acontece um crime que está até hoje sem explicação justamente dentro dessa área.
So beyond this symbolic violence committed by the state, there's actual violence being committed in these territories. There's a series of murders murder cases that against community members that haven't been clarified to date.
E é importante notar que essa divisão, essa comunidade, com essa demarcação feita em ilhas, desafia inclusive a jurisprudência do Supremo Tribunal Federal Brasileiro, que no caso da terra indígena Raposa Serra do Sol, não permitiu que esse tipo de demarcação separando a comunidade fosse feito.
So this kind of partition, sort of island partitions, is also a challenge for the judiciary system, because as seen with cases of indigenous land partition, the judiciary doesn't really allow this sort of insular partition.
Recentemente, a comunidade conseguiu uma decisão judicial reconhecendo o uso compartilhado das águas da barragem, porém, apenas uma semana depois, mais um assassinato ocorreu dentro da comunidade, de forma que, por medo da sua segurança, a comunidade continua sem acessar essas águas, embora com uma decisão judicial reconhecendo.
So the community managed to get a judicial order granting their right to have shared access to water. But soon after, a member of the community was murdered. So there's a lot of fear at the moment, and they are refraining to access these water pathways because they're afraid of serious consequences.
Bom, por fim, eu só queria dizer o quanto é difícil trazer esses mais de 10 anos de luta dessa comunidade nesse curto tempo aqui, mas é uma oportunidade muito interessante contar essa história através desses mapas e trazer um pouco do verdadeiro drama que essa comunidade vive aqui para vocês, para nós discutirmos aqui.
It's to finalize, I'd like to say how challenging it is to tell the struggles, the decades of struggles this community has faced, but it's also an interesting opportunity to show their struggle through maps.
E agradeço mais uma vez essa oportunidade de estar aqui e fico aberto para qualquer questionamento, qualquer dúvida. Obrigado.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I am open to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much to both Carlos and Julianne. That was very impactful, and thank you for sharing the story with us, Carlos, even though it is a very difficult thing to do.
Obrigada, Carlos, por compartilhar conosco, ainda que seja uma história muito difícil de ser contada.
I'm going to start with a question I think everyone has for Carlos, which is, what are the next steps for the community?
Então, Carlos, uma pergunta que provavelmente todo mundo tem é: quais são os próximos passos para a comunidade?
Bom, a comunidade ela está hoje bastante envolvida nessa luta pelo acesso à água, pelo acesso ao rio, que dá nome à comunidade.
So the community is very much involved in the struggle for nowadays to have access to water and access to the river that actually names the community.
E a comunidade também, dentro desse processo de luta, abriu outras frentes. A comunidade tem tido um diálogo muito importante com a Comissão Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, estabelecendo um novo processo de diálogo, de negociação com o Estado brasileiro.
And the community has started to join efforts with other partners and other fronts. For instance, the Carlos Direitos Humanos Interamericano.
Comissão Interamericana de Direitos Humanos.
With the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, for instance, in order to gain strength in this dialogue with the Brazilian government.
Thank you. We have a few questions that have come in with the Q&A, so I'm going to start with those, and people can still send them in as they go through. So first, Caroline Deloche asks for Edson, thank you for your amazing presentation. Isn't counter-mapping their own territory and showing them to the public dangerous for the Waorani? And is there a risk, isn't there a risk that this information can be used against them?
Well, thank you for your question. It's a very interesting question. Nowadays, we are living in a context of really full, total globalization of all spaces. I don't believe that there are indigenous peoples that can consider themselves isolated, or no one can isolate themselves anymore, because the state, especially in the reality of Ecuador in Brazil, the state has taken over taking over all territories and put them on the hands of those corporations that are invading literally indigenous territories, even demarcated lands. The land is already naked. With these new technologies of GPS and satellite photographies, etc., even the most isolated, unknown indigenous territories or forests, they are already being seen by those corporations that have money to invest in that. This is one thing we say among indigenous peoples, that the land is already naked. They already exposed to all threats that possible they can imagine. And then what is Yanomami, for example, Yanomami, another indigenous people in the north, in Brazil and Venezuela, they say that we cannot hear anymore the rivers and the forests because they are dying. They are not dying because of our actions, because the actions of those are invading our lands. Then indigenous people, they decided to go to change the narrative of being protected and isolated to political engagement. That's why those maps, they are also partnering with non-indigenous peoples organizations, especially organizations involved in activism, to help them to map their territories from their own perspectives. For example, those oil companies in Ecuador, and also agricultural projects in Brazil, in all other indigenous lands, they use maps, no indigenous people, those corporations use maps to show, look, our project, our operation has nothing to do with your territory. Actually, it is miles and miles away from your territory. And then what indigenous people are showing, look, you don't see a map that way. You draw your lines, you think that these represent our territory. Doesn't. Your map is not a mirror of the nature that we wanted to show in our maps. Actually, our mapping, or our counter mapping, if you wish, use a fancy expression word for that, we wanted to show our own perspective as how a river that has its source miles and miles away from our land, actually not reaches our land. We wanted to show all ecological implications of any project like such as oil or mining or hydroelectric in any part of the rivers will impact all species that depend on this river. Then Carlos also showed the example how colonizing states think. We will draw some lines, divide the territory, that's it. The problem solved, but it's not that way. We have to consider a map as a starting point, not the final point. The oil companies, they use map as a final point, as a last argument. This is what we're going to do, and that's it. But no, indigenous people, no. Map is the starting point, is where we should start our conversations, our discussion. Those operations should happen this or here or not. This is clearly a clash of worldviews, of course, and of course it shows a huge ignorance, even scientific ignorance of ecological impact of such things. Then to in one sentence, is not dangerous, is for protection. Here we showing our body, and in all levels, when a person shows the body, the bruises, the injuries, everything, look, treat me, take care of me, I need your protection. This is what they want.
Definitely, thank you so much for that. In a related vein with Carlos, using maps, the community using maps to fight back and saying, this isn't the end of this, we don't accept your proposal. Can you say a bit more about how those maps were made by the community during the negotiation process? Julianne, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. Continuando essa ideia de usar mapas, né, para demonstrar essa luta e para dizer nós não aceitamos essa proposta. Katie, can you repeat the end of your question, please?
Sure. So how were the maps that Carlos showed, how were they made kind of by the community during that negotiation?
Okay. Como esses mapas foram feitos pela comunidade durante essas negociações?
Perfeito. Eu havia compreendido, mas preferi confirmar contigo, Juliane. Obrigado. Bom, todos esses mapas que eu apresentei. Bom, aquele primeiro mapa foi confeccionado, como eu disse, pela própria Marinha.
So the first map was compiled by the Brazilian Marine.
E os mapas que apresentam as propostas de governo foram confeccionados pelo órgão fundiário, pelo INCRA.
And the maps which display Brazilian government proposals that were done by INCRA, which is a governmental body.
Mas durante o processo de negociação, nós também produzimos alguns mapas com a própria comunidade.
But during the process of negotiation, we also produced some maps together with the community.
Esses mapas confeccionados com a comunidade foram realizados dentro do processo de cartografia social.
So the maps compiled with the community were done in the project of social cartography.
Que busca justamente trazer essas impressões das comunidades, através dos seus usos do território, seus costumes, suas tradições, e projetar isso no mapa, até com o sentido de sensibilizar os órgãos com que nós estamos dialogando para a necessidade da titulação desse território integralmente.
So this project aims to hear communities' perspective and bring in their perspective in the compilation of maps and hopefully raise awareness and sensibilization towards these issues also in the governmental sphere.
Então, esses mapas eles foram realizados em oficinas com a comunidade, ouvindo as comunidades, fazendo reuniões dentro do próprio território, inclusive sobre o sentido estratégico de cada representação que a gente levava para o mapa nesse processo de negociação tão sensível que foi a questão territorial dessa comunidade.
So we organized workshops within the communities. We organized hearings and tried to bring in their perspective and also have a sort of strategic approach as to which maps and how and when to use along this process.
E, por fim, a confecção final do mapa foi feita com a ajuda de uma colega geógrafa, a Paula Regina Carneiro, que também é uma militante e esteve presente conosco nesses momentos, inclusive foi convidada por mim, mas não pôde estar aqui presente hoje.
And finally, the final maps were compiled with the help of a colleague, Paula Regina, and Paula Regina, sorry, who I invited to be here today, but unfortunately could not be here, who, besides being a geographer, is also an activist.
Great, thank you so much. And we actually have a follow-up question to that from Daniel Brownstein, asking if Carlos could say a bit more about the specific negotiations about water sources and the water sources that were coming in.
Carlos, você pode nos contar um pouquinho detalhes mais específicos sobre essa negociação em relação ao acesso de água?
Sim, a questão da água ela é muito sensível na comunidade e vem de essa imposição do não acesso à água vem nos remete a uma estratégia mesmo de guerra da Marinha do Brasil, que sempre foi de proibir o plantio dentro do território, alegando que se tratava de uma área da Marinha, porque aquelas fazendas que eu mostrei
Hang on a minute. So this is a very sensitive issue for the community, and they experience a sort of war strategy from the part of the Brazilian Marine. The Brazilian Marine has always prohibited the use of land for agricultural purposes and also access to water.
Isso, porque aquelas terras das antigas fazendas que no período colonial utilizaram da mão de obra escrava, que são os antepassados da comunidade, aquelas terras das fazendas foram doadas à Marinha, que tinha título de propriedade sobre aquelas terras.
So the original farmlands, remember the farmlands, these huge farms from the colonial periods, which use slave hand in the plantations. These farmlands were donated by the government through the Brazilian Marine.
Então, a Marinha, com a posse desse título de propriedade, passa a alegar que aquela área é de importância para a própria segurança nacional.
So the Marine affirms, after receiving land titles, that this area is a very important area in terms of national security.
E se coloca numa posição de opressão sobre a comunidade, de impedir o plantio, tentar limitar o acesso à água, à pesca, à destruição de espaços religiosos, uma série de privações.
So the Marine positions itself as an oppressor, prohibiting access to agricultural land, access to water pathways, access to religious sacred sites.
Então, quando aquela proposta final de titulação do território vem com a exclusão de toda a área agricultável e de todas as fontes de água da comunidade,
So when the final proposal came through, hindering access to agricultural areas and water pathways,
nós vemos essa proposta como uma tentativa de destruição física e cultural e espiritual daquela comunidade.
we interpreted this proposal as an attempt to physically and spiritually destroy and also culturally destroy the community.
Porque como o Edson Krenak trouxe muito evidente para a gente, essas comunidades não têm como darem continuidade à sua existência sem esse acesso às suas áreas de terra, de água, faz parte de toda essa cosmovisão de que o Edson acabou de falar. E com todas essas privações, a comunidade não teria como sobreviver naquele território que foi titulado.
So just as Edson explained, in the case of indigenous people, this deprivation of water access to land, and also religious sites implicates the death or the discontinuation of a people, because in their cosmology, they cannot live with all these aspects.
Mas, nesse caso, a comunidade precisou aceitar, ainda que provisoriamente, ainda que não tenha desistido dessa luta, essa titulação do jeito que está, pelo menos para garantir uma conquista e continuar a ter forças para continuar lutando pelo seu território integral e pelo acesso a essas águas.
In this case, the community was forced to accept this faulty proposal, even if only temporarily, as a means of being able to continue to struggle and gain access to the original area.
Por fim, há poucas semanas, nós tivemos a primeira decisão judicial nesse processo, reconhecendo a possibilidade de um uso compartilhado das águas da barragem, mas é um processo que ainda está em curso, não é uma decisão final ainda.
So just recently we had a judicial order recognizing the joint access to water, but this is an ongoing process that hasn't been closed up yet.
Thank you for explaining that so much, Carlos. So we still have a couple more questions. Quinn Walker would like to know, how do older non-Indigenous maps and histories that include myths and god influences, they bring up the idea of here be dragons and Herodotus, and how do these relate and differ from Indigenous inclusion? So maybe Edson, you mentioned a bit about that at the beginning of your talk, if you could repeat that a bit.
Sure. It's a good question, very interesting. I'd love to be a historian and to discuss more about this, the Herodotus maps and who made them and in which context they appeared in history. However, I can say almost 100% sure that those maps, they appeared or they exist based on unknown territory. There is this first part of my answer. The indigenous maps, they don't use myth in a common sense idea of myth. Maybe you are referring to myth or mythology as imaginary, created to maybe give explanations to unknown lands, unknown realities. But the indigenous maps, myth, when you use myth for indigenous people, we are talking about worlds that cannot be accessed in a simple way as we do. Who access usually those maps are the shamans, those worlds are the shamans, based on the cosmological narratives, stories, etc. Then we enter in a different type of answer. I have to consider the ontological aspect of this representation. because either way, maps, they are discourses that of power. I don't know if my friends, my indigenous colleagues and friends, they will agree with me, but both maps, they are war machines. And then my question is, who is going to win this war? For indigenous peoples, the species represented in their maps protect life on the planet. It's a fight for life. Let's defend our territory, right? That showed all these perspectives that our map recenters the multiplicity at the most important reason why we map these territories. The non-indigenous map, or the maps at least that the indigenous people know, the center of those maps or those discourse is a monologic, monocultural, and endeavor to conquer those territories that are unknown or full of cannibals or terra nullis, all these descriptions that we know from the Middle Ages, right? And then we have these two aspects that, or three, that we have to consider: the context, the ontological meaning of those maps, with reality is those maps are representing. If we use the concept of Horthy, the philosopher, the mirror of nature, we are talking about which nature? A nature that is unknown, to be there, to be explored, conquered, destroyed, that has the extractivism as a method of really knowing this territory, or is a nature that is my home, it represents my body, I have relations, I depend on it, etc. And then I think this is a two very different discourses on this idea of myth and maps, or how they are represented. It's to talk about monsters. Indigenous people, they don't believe in monsters, of course, but I also wonder if the Greeks and all Europeans in the Middle Ages, they really believed in monsters, or the monster was part of a war machine to justify war, to justify sort of a lot of violence, symbolic or real violence. I don't know. It's a long discussion, I know, but we know that we have also limitation our time here. Yeah, but thank you for interesting question. I like those questions.
No, that was a great answer too. You took it in a really interesting direction. Our last question is going to come from Alberto Diaz Calleros. And he asks both speakers if you could share with us your view on the extent to which Quilombo communities of Afro-Brazilians are similar or different from indigenous communities in the Amazon. In Colombia, for example, resguardos of Afro-Colombian descent have adopted the indigenous forms of governance. Is the same thing happening in Brazil? And Julianne, I can repeat that if you want.
Ok. Carlos, a pergunta é para vocês dois, é para você e o Edson. Até que ponto as comunidades quilombolas no Brasil são semelhantes ou diferentes das comunidades indígenas na Amazônia ou na Colômbia? Na Colômbia, por exemplo, resquícios, né, de afrocolombianos adotaram formas de governança indígenas. E a pergunta é se esse tipo de característica se vê na região, se vê no Brasil.
Bom, eu vou começar então. É uma pergunta muito interessante. Bom, eu acho que a diferença essencial é que os povos indígenas eles já estavam aqui no continente americano antes do processo colonial,
So the main difference is that the indigenous people were already here in this territory before the process of colonization.
Enquanto que o povo negro, diversos povos negros do continente africano foram sequestrados e trazidos para cá à força para servir de mão de obra escrava.
Whilst many different African people were kidnapped and brought here by force to serve as working hands on farms and plantations.
E nesse processo, esses povos que foram trazidos para cá tiveram que se reinventar, tiveram que reinventar suas culturas aqui em outro continente e, óbvio, com influências tanto do colonizador quanto dos povos originários, dos povos indígenas que já estavam aqui.
And as a result, the forcefully brought people had to reinvent themselves, and they, of course, carry a lot of influence in this reinvention process, a lot of influence from colonizers, but also indigenous people.
Então, a história brasileira, ela registra muito também a união entre povos indígenas e comunidades quilombolas que eram formadas por estes negros que eram aqui escravizados e conseguiam fugir e formar comunidades independentes. Tem muitos casos de alianças entre esses povos para resistir ao colonizador.
So the history in Brazil shows a long history of alliances between Quilombola communities and indigenous communities in attempt to resist.
E ainda hoje, nós conseguimos observar que existem formas de resistência também semelhantes entre as comunidades quilombolas e os povos indígenas.
And even today, we can still see that there are resistant forms that are very similar for Quilombola communities and indigenous communities.
E aqui eu trago o exemplo das retomadas de terras. São formas retomadas de terras.
And
retomadas.
As an example, the land retake that has been taking place.
São processos de recuperação territorial desses povos que consistem em reocupar as áreas das quais eles foram expulsos em tempos anteriores, principalmente em tempos mais recentes, como foi o período de ditadura civil-militar aqui no Brasil.
And this process entails the reoccupation of lands which were traditionally occupied by this period, people. In particularly, he refers to the period of dictatorship in Brazil.
Bom, e também, do ponto de vista legal também, nós temos bastante diferenças, apenas ficando aqui num caso, enquanto a Constituição brasileira reconhece a propriedade aos povos indígenas, aqui, às comunidades quilombolas, os povos indígenas têm a posse de seus territórios.
So there are though some legal differences. While the Brazilian Constitution recognized the right to property for the Quilombola community, direito de ocupação dos indígenas, é isso?
Isso.
It only recognized the right to occupation for the indigenous people.
Mas, independente dessas diferenças e que trazem aí outras diferenças enquanto procedimento para o reconhecimento dessas terras,
so regardless of these differences, which have to do with proceedings in connection to the recognition of land use and right,
eu vejo como um grande problema ainda na legislação brasileira quanto a esses povos e comunidades.
I see as a great problem in our legislation.
O fato de que a legislação brasileira não reconhece um pluralismo jurídico, não reconhece as formas próprias.
The fact that the Brazilian legislation does not recognize plurality.
Não reconhece as formas próprias de organizações jurídicas desses povos e dessas comunidades.
It doesn't recognize self-governance and the different ways of self-governance which these communities traditionally live.
Daí também nós temos a fonte desses conflitos como esses que nós narramos aqui hoje.
And that's the source of many conflicts, such as the ones that we narrated here today.
Obrigado, Juliane.
That was it.
Edson, did you want to add anything with that one?
Thank you. Just a few things, not much to add, because he actually they gave us like a short class, really interesting and clear and perfect answer. Thank you, Carlos. But when we ask who are the Maroon people, the Quilombola people in Brazil, they are first traditional communities. I think it's not our right to say that you are traditional, but you are not from here. Who defines what is traditional, right? They are many of those communities. They live for centuries in those territories. They reshaped their own culture, their identity based on the territory that embraced them, and the territories that host them, house them, and also lived and inhabited by many indigenous communities. It's interesting to when you read the Brazilian history, you see that many Black communities already in the 17th, 18th century, many indigenous people were helped by Quilombola people, by Africans. That were indigenous peoples that were kidnapped from Africa into Brazil, right? There is one case, for example, they almost mixed. The Tupiniquim people in Brazil is indigenous people recognized by the Constitution of 1988. But if you talk to them, if you see them, you're going to see a lot of, I would say, biological traits, biological physiognomies of Black people. They tell for many decades, in the 18th century, 19th century, we lived with Black people. We protected each other. They became indigenous with us, among us. It's unfortunately, as Carlos mentioned, Brazil, even though we have a good constitution, good laws in terms of possibilities for a legal protection, the Brazilian constitution does not recognize legal pluralism, and they cannot have their own governance or laws or regulations, etc. But they enjoy among indigenous people certain freedom to live, to have their own religion. Some they have their own language. They speak Yoruba, they have their own rituals, they have their own culture, flourishing, being protected, and also suffering the same threats that indigenous peoples are suffering, especially in this government, under Bolsonaro's government, that he even during his election, his campaign to be elected, he said terrible things against indigenous peoples and against Quilombola people. He targeted both groups as the enemies of the state, both groups that always had to live against the state. That's why we also call ourselves societies against the state, because the state has always been like has always have like a plan to integrate, assimilate, and to destroy those communities.
Thank you for that. A really good, powerful summation of that issue. The only question I have left for our speakers is that several people would like to get in touch with you to ask further questions and ask about the slides. Is it okay if we put your emails in the chat so people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, no problem.
Carlos, várias pessoas perguntam se podem entrar em contato com vocês em privado e ter acesso aos slides. E a Kate quer saber se fica ok para você se ela coloca o seu e-mail aqui no chat para os convidados.
Pode sim, fica à vontade.
Yes, you may do so.
Perfect. So we will do that in the chat in just a second. And all that's left is to thank you all sincerely, especially Julianne, for helping us with the translation. And we are now going to go to a break, everybody, and we will be back at 12:45 Pacific Daylight Time. But again, thank you so much to both our panelists and to Julianne. Thank you, everybody.